Hello, everyone. It's Chris Hobart, the Wealthologist, and today, we're going to be talking about some eye-popping numbers. The Federal Reserve's budget deficit for the fiscal year 2024, it is a whopping $1.9 trillion. Now, that's 6.7% of the nation's GDP. Now, I get it. Talking about the federal budget deficit might not sound like the most exciting topic. Totally understand. But stick with me, because today we're going to break it down in a way that's easy to follow, but more importantly, we're going to explore why this massive deficit matters for all of us. So first, why is it such a big deal? Well, let me put it into some context. Historically, when you see deficits this high, it's usually because the U.S. is either in the middle of a major war, like World War I or II, or we're bouncing back from a major recession. But here's the thing. Neither of those is happening right now. Let me give you some context. Back in 2012, the deficit was about the same size. But if you remember, that's when we were recovering from the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. At that time, unemployment, it was hovering at 8.3%. Now, this year, unemployment's around 4%. So we're talking about half, right? So the question is, what's driving this massive deficit? We're not at war and the economy's humming along pretty well. There's really no clear excuse for it to be quite so high. Let's go back a couple of years, really to the last time where things were really in check when we look at these numbers, and we're going to go to 2019. And I want you to see what's changed a little bit since then. So we're going to go back. And at that time, like now, the economy was humming along. But in 2019, the deficit was 4.6% of GDP. Now, here's the thing, that's still big, but nothing compared to today's 6.7%. So the question is, what's changed? Sometimes people say, well, maybe the government's bringing in less money. Not the case. In fact, revenues are actually higher now than they were in 2019. Back then, the government collected $3.5 trillion in revenue, which is still a big old number, right? But this year, that number is up to $4.9 trillion, a whopping $1.4 trillion more. So the government's making more money. Why is the deficit ballooning? Well, if you had the same problem at your house, I'm pretty sure you'd figure it out pretty quickly. The answer lies in spending. So let's break it down to three key areas of spending where the government really has spending that's skyrocketed quite a bit. Number one, the growing cost associated with debt. The interest on federal debt is through the roof right now. Think of it like this. When you borrow money or when I borrow money, we've got to pay interest, right? Well, the federal government, no different. They've got to pay interest. In 2019, interest payments were about 1.8% of GDP. This year, because of increased interest rates, it's up to 3.1%. That's the highest it's been since 1995. Now, as this debt grows, so do the interest payments. And this is a trend that's only going to get worse unless something changes. Second thing is what we call other mandatory spending. And when we talk about other mandatory spending, this is where it gets a little bit interesting. I think the best example, and again, some folks are going to love this, some folks are going to hate this, but the current administration made some moves this past couple of years to forgive student loans. Some of it was successful, and others were struck down by the Supreme Court. Now, when the government forgives a loan, it counts the lost future repayments as current spending. So this has added billions to this year's deficit. In 2019, other spending was about 2.7% of GDP. This year, it's jumped to 3.8%. The third thing to look at is healthcare costs, specifically when we talk about Medicare and Medicaid. When we think about those programs that are funded by the government, they were already expensive, right? But in the past 5 years, costs have only gone up. In 2019, they made up 5.3% of GDP. This year, they're at 5.8%. And with an aging population, you guessed it, those costs are only going to keep going up and rising unless some major reforms are made. So I think the question is, what's next? What does this all mean for you, for me, for our kids, for the country? The bottom line is that the U.S. has some serious budget challenges, no question about it. And while it might not feel urgent right now, the clock is ticking. For years, low interest rates, they really let us ignore the growing debt, kind of let us say, hey, not a problem. But that's really no longer an option with where interest rates currently are. No matter who's elected in the next election, tackling this growing deficit, it's gotta be a major priority. And we're going to need to make some tough decisions, whether that's cutting spending or raising taxes or a combination of both. And we've talked about this for years, that that's a reality that we're going to have to face at some point. The thing is, this is a lot to digest, but here's a key takeaway. The $1.9 trillion deficit, it's not just a number on a spreadsheet. It's a signal that big changes are coming, and those changes will impact all of us, from taxes to the services that we rely on. So, what do you think? Should the government focus more on cutting spending, raising revenues, or both? And yes, when I say raising revenues, that means increasing taxes. Do me a favor. Drop us your thoughts in the comments or shoot us an email here at the office. And as always, if you found this information helpful, be sure to like it and subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Once again, I'm Chris Hobart, the Wealthologist, and I'll see you next week.